Just outside the front entrance of our temple building, above those steps facing Sunset Boulevard, there's a familiar Jewish symbol affixed above the large wooden doors. 2 stone tablets with the words of 10 commandments engraved upon them. The familiar shape and form of the tablets have become iconic over the centuries. They appear in images of biblical literature through the centuries, in classical sculpture and painting. They've been reimagined and re-rendered in stained glass in thousands of synagogues around the world. 2 stone tablets, carried in Moses' arms as he receives the law on Mount Sinai and carries them down the mountain to the Israelites waiting for him far below. Now, tradition tells us that the 10 Commandments were chiseled into stone on those tablets to signify the permanent and binding nature of God's law, which would guide our ancestors as they built themselves into a new nation, founded on morality and justice. Now, this week, our Torah portion contains a variation on a theme about law being written in stone. But in this case, the stones carrying the law are used very differently. The text of our parsha this week describes a practice that Moses commands to the people as they make their way across the river and into the Promised Land. When they walk through the valley, he tells them to gather a set of stones. But in this case, he describes enormous slabs of rock that can be stood on end, like Jewish Stonehenge. According to Moses' instructions, the stones should be coated with plaster, and on them will be written the words of God's instructions, which the people can read as they pass by them on their way into their new home. This text may raise more questions than it answers. Why the change from small rocks that could be held in a person's arms to these giant ones that rest standing on the ground? Why the shift from a hammer and chisel to the use of plaster and ink? And maybe the most mysterious of them all, what would be written on them? What rules would be written on those giant stones that we read together as we passed? Well, in the early 19th century, there was a rabbi in Italy named Shmuel David Luzzatto. You might not know that that's a Jewish name, Luzzatto, but it was. And Rabbi Luzzatto proposes an answer to these questions in his commentary in this section of the Torah. Here's what he proposes. The words were written onto the surface of the plaster, he writes, not carved into the stone itself, because these words were not intended to last throughout all generations. They were only meant to stand before the people's eyes at this particular hour. Luzzatto's hypothesis is that these large stones come to serve a fundamentally different purpose than the one served by those smaller stones on which the 10 Commandments were carved. The whole point of these giant stones, he says, is that they're meant to hold instructions that are temporary. Unlike the timeless, immutable truth of God's prohibitions on idolatry and theft and murder, the writings on these stones would fade away eventually after enough exposure to bright sunlight or hard rain. They comprise a temporary Torah, filled with just enough wisdom and comfort to tide us over, just enough guidance for those people in that place at one particular moment. There's kind of a running joke that members of the clergy tell each other often, regardless of their faith or denomination. There's a line that we say to each other all the time, and it's become kind of a cliche, and here's what it is. If you're a preacher, The sermons that you tend to give most often, you'll find, are not sermons that your congregants need the most. The sermons that you tend to preach most often are the ones that you need to hear the most. I've always suspected that there is deep truth in that worn-out cliche, but I've been feeling it more powerfully than ever lately, especially when I sat down to write this week and I came across Rabbi Luzzatto's image of those stones where God's guidance would be written temporarily, like a giant dry erase whiteboard. Because the sermon that I need to hear the most this week was a reminder that sometimes what we need more than anything else isn't a thundering eternal truth carved in stone for all eternity. Sometimes what we need is just a temporary reassurance that we're going to be okay. Just a little gentle reminder that'll last just long enough for us to get through difficult and uncertain times. A note on the holy whiteboard to help us keep going, to acknowledge that we're doing the best we can, and that whoever we are right now is good enough. Just knowing that we're okay, exactly as we are, can help us make it through until tomorrow. Because if we're honest, the truth is that lots and lots of us are not feeling okay these days. As the number of COVID cases in Texas public schools tripled this week, and school-aged kids still can't get vaccinated, lots and lots of parents with young kids at home are not doing okay. As the medical center strains under an extraordinary burden of patient care, doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers are not okay. And those who are caring for aging parents while struggling to do a great job at work and maintain their friendships and their community at the same time, they're not very okay either. So yeah, this week I find myself very interested in a kind of Torah that is enough to get us through whatever this is. I would be very grateful indeed for some tiny tidbits of guidance written on a giant stone tablet, even temporarily, like Rabbi Luzzatto envisioned, placed before our eyes at this particular hour to help us get back to feeling okay again. So what kind of Torah would that be? What words of wisdom would help reassure you when you're not feeling very okay? What would you put on a giant stone whiteboard to help you feel inspired and carry you through another uncertain and challenging day? For some of us, maybe we just need a reminder that if we're doing what we can, it'll be good enough. You know, there's deep wisdom and great comfort in a Torah of being good enough. And that might be the kind of Torah that we need this week. Parents who are scrambling after a harrowing and exhausting week to feed their kids a nutritious and healthy dinner, sometimes mac and cheese is good enough. During a week when you kept promising yourself that you'd clean up the whole house, maybe putting away one thing will be good enough. If you've been meaning to write a long and heartfelt letter to revive a friendship that you've been neglecting, maybe a little text message is good enough. So I don't know about anyone else, but a sermon about being good enough is exactly the one that I needed this Shabbat. The story about the giant whitewashed stones is told in our Torah portion close to the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And then it's not returned to again until later in the Bible, in the book of Joshua. And Joshua comes back to talk about those giant stones quite a bit later. Joshua decrees that those giant stones should stand in place forever, even long after the plaster wore off. And he says that this is the case so that future generations children will have to ask their parents what they meant. So if the writing was temporary, if the words would wash away over time, what are the parents supposed to tell their children? Maybe they'll tell them this: a long time ago, your parents needed a reminder, but today they're a reminder for you. Those stones are there because we weren't perfect, but we tried, and most of the time we were good enough. We're all moving together toward a new year, and maybe it's a little bit too much to think about our loftiest resolutions and our grandiose goals and promises for a whole year. Instead, maybe we can content ourselves with looking at what will be useful to be placed before our eyes in this place at this particular hour. And maybe a commitment to be good enough will be good enough for us and for our children. And maybe with a little luck, God will determine as well that we were good enough. Shabbat shalom, everyone.